What if I told you that somewhere beneath the Pacific Ocean lies a city that defied every law of physics and human understanding? A place where electric lights have burned continuously for over 70 years underwater, powered by something that shouldn't exist. This is the story of Marcus Delacroix, a deep-sea salvage diver whose discovery in 1953 would haunt him until his death, and the terrifying truth behind the impossible city that the world was never meant to find. Marcus was no ordinary diver. By 1953, he had already spent 15 years exploring the deepest, most dangerous waters off the California coast. He'd seen sunken warships, retrieved bodies from depths that would crush most men, and witnessed things in the abyss that he never spoke about. But nothing had prepared him for what he would find 180 feet below the surface, in waters so remote that no ship had ever charted them. It began with a routine salvage operation. A wealthy collector had hired Marcus to recover artifacts from what sonar had identified as a large metallic structure on the ocean floor. The pay was exceptional, enough to retire on, but there was something unsettling about his employer. The man, who called himself Dr. Ashworth, had pale, almost translucent skin and eyes that seemed to reflect light like a nocturnal animal's. When Marcus asked how he knew about the wreck, Ashworth simply smiled and said, "Some things call to those who are ready to find them." The descent began at dawn on November 13th. Marcus had made this type of dive thousands of times, but as he sank deeper into the black waters, his equipment began behaving strangely. His depth gauge flickered between readings, his compass spun wildly, and most disturbing of all, his radio crackled with voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize. At 160 feet, the voices stopped. The silence was absolute, more complete than anything he had ever experienced underwater. Then he saw the lights dot at first. Marcus thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Pinpricks of warm yellow light glowed in the distance, impossible and beautiful. As he drew closer, the full scope of what lay before him became clear. It wasn't a sunken ship or a natural formation. It was a city, an entire underwater city with streets, buildings, and impossibly working electric lights lining every pathway and illuminating every window. The architecture was unlike anything from human civilization. The buildings seemed to grow from the ocean floor like coral, but they were made of a material that looked like black glass fused with metal. Spires twisted upward in spirals that hurt to look at directly, and archways formed shapes that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could process. But most unsettling of all were the lights, thousands of them, burning bright and steady as if they had been installed yesterday, not decades ago, on the ocean floor. Marcus's training told him to surface immediately. Nothing about this made sense. Electricity and water don't mix, especially not at this depth, under this pressure. Yet here was an entire city, clearly ancient, with a power grid that functioned perfectly. His curiosity, however, was stronger than his fear. He had to know more. Swimming closer to what appeared to be the city's main street, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. The lights weren't just randomly placed. They formed patterns, symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. And beneath the gentle glow, he could see movement, shadows that didn't match anything casting them, shapes that darted between the buildings too quickly for him to focus on. The water around the city felt different too, warmer, despite the depth, and it had a slight electrical charge that made his skin tingle through his diving suit. His air gauge showed he had plenty of time left, but Marcus found himself breathing heavily, his heart pounding in a rhythm that seemed to match the pulsing of the lights below. He decided to enter one of the smaller buildings near the city's edge. The doorway, if it could be called that, was a perfect circle that dilated open as he approached, like the iris of an enormous eye. Inside, the building was dry. Completely, impossibly dry. Marcus found himself breathing air instead of using his regulator, though by all laws of physics, he should have been crushed by the water pressure or drowned instantly. The interior was lit by the same warm lights, embedded in walls that seemed to be made of living tissue rather than stone or Metal, furniture, or what Marcus assumed was furniture, lined the room. Chairs and tables that looked grown rather than built, their surfaces pulsing gently with bioluminescent veins. On what might have been a desk sat objects that defied description, geometric shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves, books bound in material that looked like human skin but felt warm to the touch. It was then that Marcus heard the whispers. Soft voices speaking in harmony, coming from everywhere and nowhere. They weren't speaking English, or any language he recognized, but somehow he understood them. They were welcoming him home. They said they had been waiting for him, that his arrival had been foretold long before his birth. They spoke of the surface world with disgust, calling it a corruption, a mistake that needed to be corrected. Marcus backed toward the circular door, but it had closed. The walls were solid, seamless. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They told him about the city's true purpose, how it had been built, not by humans, but by something far older, something that had watched humanity's development with growing disappointment. The lights, they explained, weren't powered by electricity, but by life force itself. The energy of everything that had died in the ocean above, trapped and converted into power for their eternal city. The voices revealed the most horrifying truth of all. The city wasn't empty. It was full of inhabitants, humans who had found their way down over the centuries. Explorers, sailors, divers, like Marcus, who had been drawn by the lights and chosen to stay. They existed now as something between life and death, their consciousness absorbed into the city's collective, while their bodies provided the biological energy that kept the lights burning. Marcus could see them now. Translucent figures moving through the walls, their faces frozen in expressions of blissful terror. They reached out to him, their mouths moving in silent screams, or perhaps songs of welcome. Among them, he recognized faces from Missing Person, reports he'd seen over the years, divers who had vanished without a trace, their bodies never recovered. The whispers explained that the surface world was dying, poisoned by humanity's greed and ignorance. But here, in their eternal city, consciousness could live forever, contributing to something beautiful and meaningful. All Marcus had to do was remove his diving suit and let the city's embrace take him. He would become part of something greater, his knowledge and experience adding to the collective wisdom of the deep. For a moment, Marcus was tempted. The promise of eternal existence, of being part of something beyond human understanding, was seductive. But then he remembered the pale Dr. Ashworth, his animal eyes and knowing smile. Marcus realized he hadn't been hired to salvage artifacts. He had been recruited, chosen specifically because of his expertise and his willingness to go where others feared to tread. Ashworth wasn't human. He was a recruiter for the city, sent to the surface to find suitable candidates. Using every ounce of willpower he possessed, Marcus focused on the circular door. He pressed his hands against the warm, living wall and demanded to be released. The whispers became angry, then pleading, then threatening. The lights flickered and dimmed. The translucent figures pressed closer, their faces contorting with rage and desperation. But Marcus held firm. He had a life on the surface, people who would miss him. He refused to become another source of power for their impossible city. The door dilated open suddenly, and Marcus found himself back in the crushing cold of the deep ocean. His regulator was in his mouth, his diving suit intact. For a moment, he wondered if he had hallucinated the entire experience, some kind of nitrogen narcosis-induced dream. But when he looked back at the city, it was still there, still glowing, with its impossible lights. And now he could see the truth of what powered them. Floating throughout the city, barely visible unless you knew to look for them, were thousands of human forms. They pulsed gently with the same warm light, their life force eternally harvested to power the ancient city. Marcus ascended as quickly as safely possible, his mind reeling with what he had witnessed. When he broke the surface, Dr. Ashworth was waiting on the boat, his pale face expectant. But when he saw Marcus alive and alone, his expression turned to one of cold fury. Without a word, Ashworth dove over the side of the boat and disappeared beneath the waves. Marcus never saw him again. The salvage diver tried to report what he had found, but no one believed him. The authorities dismissed his story as a case of severe decompression sickness affecting his mental state. When he offered to guide other divers to the location, he found that he couldn't remember the exact coordinates. The city's location had been wiped from his memory, leaving only the terrible knowledge of what lay beneath the waves. Marcus spent the remaining 30 years of his life trying to find the city again, diving in the same general area whenever he could afford it. He never found it, but he claimed that on clear nights, if you knew where to look, you could see a faint glow beneath the waves. He said the city was growing, spreading, preparing for something. He believed that one day, when the surface world had finally destroyed itself with war and pollution, the city would rise from the depths to claim what remained. Marcus died in 1983. Found in his apartment with a diving suit laid out on his bed and a note that simply read, "There, calling me home." His body showed no signs of illness or injury, but those who knew him said his eyes had been getting paler in his final years. More reflective, more like those of something that belonged in the deep places of the world. The story might have ended there, dismissed as the ravings of a man driven mad by too many deep dives and too much time alone with the abyss. But in 2012, a deep-sea research vessel detected an anomalous energy signature in the Pacific, roughly 50 miles from Marcus's last known diving location. The signature pulsed in a regular pattern, like a heartbeat or breathing. When they sent down a remotely operated vehicle to investigate, they found something that shouldn't exist. The footage, classified by the Navy and never released to the public, allegedly shows a vast structure on the ocean floor, glowing with warm light. The ROV's cameras malfunctioned when they got too close, but not before capturing images of what appeared to be streets, buildings, and most disturbingly, figures moving among them. The energy readings spiked off their instruments, showing power output that rivaled a nuclear reactor. The research team tried to retrieve the ROV, but it had stopped responding to commands. The last transmission received was audio only, voices, singing in harmony in a language that linguists couldn't identify. When Navy divers went down to recover the vehicle, they found nothing but empty ocean floor. The energy signature was gone, as if the entire city had simply moved to a different location. Since then, there have been reports from fishing vessels and cargo ships of strange lights beneath the waves, always moving, never staying in one place long enough to be properly investigated. Marine biologists have noted unusual die-offs in certain areas of the Pacific. Fish found floating on the surface with their life force somehow drained. Their bodies intact, but empty of whatever spark makes life possible. Some researchers believe that Marcus Delacroix's underwater city was real, a remnant of some pre-human civilization that learned to harness life energy itself as a power source. They theorize that it's not content to remain hidden forever, that it's slowly expanding its influence, preparing to reclaim a world it considers rightfully its own. Others dismiss these theories as conspiracy thinking, the product of too many science fiction movies and urban legends. But deep-sea divers still whisper about warm lights in the cold depths, about voices that speak without words, about cities that shouldn't exist, calling to those brave or foolish enough to search for them. They tell each other to avoid diving alone in the deep waters of the Pacific, especially on November 13th, the anniversary of Marcus's first encounter with the impossible city. Because sometimes, they say, if you go deep enough and stay long enough in the crushing darkness of the abyss, you might see lights that don't belong there. And if you're unlucky enough to investigate, you might discover that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. The city is still down there, still growing, still powered by the life force of those who came before, and it's still recruiting, sending its pale-eyed agents to the surface to find those ready to join its eternal, electric embrace. The question isn't whether Marcus Delacroix's story was true. The question is whether you're brave enough to dive deep enough to find out for yourself. But remember, if you do decide to search for the city that burns beneath the waves, make sure someone knows where you've gone. Because the lights that have been shining for 70 years underwater are always looking for new sources of power, and in the crushing depths of the ocean, no one can hear you scream. But they can certainly hear you sing in harmony with the voices of the eternally lost.